I am Kiara, 35 years old, and a forensic accountant who built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from the ground up. For over a decade, I was the unappreciated financial backbone of my family, paying for their lavish lifestyles just to keep the peace. But at my younger sister's $50,000 wedding, which I entirely funded, she grabbed the microphone and tearfully accused me of sleeping with her new husband. As the ballroom of 200 guests gasped in horror, my own husband stood up, threw down his napkin, and loudly agreed with her. I did not cry or run away. I simply smiled, logged into the venue sound system, and broadcasted a security video from my own living room that froze the entire room in dead silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your assets. Growing up in a middle-class suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, my mother, Loretta, made our family dynamic incredibly clear from day one. My younger sister Jasmine was the beauty, the golden child destined for high society, and I was the workhorse. Our house was always filled with women from our church congregation, praising Jasmine for her perfect smile and effortless charm, while I was tucked away at the kitchen table, crunching numbers and studying for my advanced placement exams. My mother constantly reminded me that since I was not naturally blessed with my sister's magnetism, I needed to make sure I could at least be useful. I took that lesson to heart. I worked tirelessly, skipped the college parties, and eventually launched a forensic accounting firm that specialized in tracking hidden corporate assets. I became highly successful, but in my mother's eyes, my wealth was simply a communal resource designed to elevate Jasmine's life. Fast forward to the present day, I found myself sitting at the VIP table inside the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the most exclusive venue in the city, boasting floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, and polished marble floors. I sat quietly in my custom silk gown, mentally calculating the exact cost of everything surrounding me. The towering floral centerpieces on the tables, packed with imported white orchids and rare blue hydrangeas, cost me $12,000 alone. The premium open bar, currently serving top-shelf liquor to my greedy relatives, was quickly approaching the $10,000 mark. I had even paid for the string quartet playing softly in the corner and the 6-tier fondant cake sitting under a spotlight. I was exhausted, but I kept telling myself that after tonight, Jasmine would finally be married and legally tethered to someone else's bank account. That someone else was Connor. He was a 34-year-old white man who had moved to Atlanta, boasting about his booming tech startup. My mother and sister practically worshipped him. To them, he was the ultimate prize, a handsome, supposedly wealthy entrepreneur who would give Jasmine the luxury life she believed she was owed. But as a forensic accountant, I noticed details that others ignore. I noticed how Connor always seemed to have his funds tied up in investments whenever a major deposit for the wedding was due. I noticed how his designer suits were slightly outdated and how he deflected any specific questions about his company's revenue models. But whenever I tried to warn my mother, she accused me of being a bitter, jealous woman who could not stand to see her younger sister marry better than she did. To keep the peace and avoid being alienated from the only family I had, I absorbed the costs. I wrote the checks. I smiled for the cameras. Sitting next to me at the reception was my husband of 5 years, Jamal. Jamal was a handsome, charismatic corporate manager who loved the perks of being married to a high-earning woman. He drove the luxury sports car I bought for his birthday and wore the tailored suits I paid for, but beneath the surface he was deeply insecure about my success. Lately he had been distant, picking fights over trivial things and spending late nights at the office. I had chalked it up to stress, completely unaware of the venomous betrayal he was brewing right under my roof. The dinner service was coming to an end. Waiters in pristine white coats were clearing the gold-rimmed plates from the tables. The hum of laughter and lively conversation echoed through the massive room. At table 4, Pastor Thomas from our childhood church was holding court, surrounded by the most judgmental elders of our congregation. It was time for the toasts. The wedding planner nodded at Jasmine, handing her a silver microphone. Jasmine stood up, smoothing down the skirt of her $15,000 designer gown, another expense sitting firmly on my platinum credit card. She tapped a spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp clinking sound cut through the ambient noise, and the 200 guests immediately quieted down, turning their attention to the radiant bride. I leaned back in my chair, taking a sip of sparkling water, expecting the usual performance. I anticipated a dramatic, tear-jerking speech about finding her soulmate, followed by a brief, obligatory thank you to me for making the day possible. Instead, Jasmine stood silent for a long moment. Her bottom lip began to tremble. She looked down at the floor, taking a shaky breath before lifting her eyes, but she did not look at Connor. She looked directly at me. Her voice echoed through the sound system, thick with manufactured heartbreak. She said she could not start her sacred marriage built on a foundation of lies and deceit. She said that this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but someone sitting at the head table had tried to destroy it. The ballroom fell utterly silent. You could hear a pin drop. My mother, sitting on the other side of Jasmine, clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with dramatic anticipation. Then Jasmine raised her hand and pointed her manicured finger straight at my face. She screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, claiming that I had been secretly sleeping with Connor for the past 3 months. She sobbed violently, accusing me of being so profoundly jealous of her happiness that I used my money to manipulate her fiancé into my bed. She called me a pathetic, lonely woman who had to buy love because I was entirely incapable of keeping my own husband satisfied. The collective gasp from the room felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the ballroom. I felt 200 pairs of eyes snap toward me. The church elders began whispering frantically. Pastor Thomas looked utterly scandalized. I sat completely frozen, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude and audacity of the lie being broadcasted to our entire community. I looked over at Connor. Instead of grabbing the microphone and defending me instead of clearing my name, he looked down at his lap and rubbed his face, playing the role of the guilty, ashamed man who had been caught in a moment of weakness. It was a coordinated performance. I turned to my left, looking at my husband Jamal, expecting him to jump to his feet and defend his wife against this insane, baseless character assassination. I waited for him to demand respect for the woman who provided the life of luxury he so thoroughly enjoyed. Instead, the heavy wooden chair next to me scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Jamal stood up to his full height. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, practiced disgust. He threw his folded linen napkin onto the center of the table with a dramatic sigh that caught the attention of everyone watching. He declared loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the back of the room, that he had suspected this for weeks. He told the crowd that he had found the text messages on my phone that very morning. He looked at Jasmine, offering her a nod of pathetic solidarity, and announced to the horrified audience that he was packing his bags tonight and contacting his divorce attorney on Monday morning. The heavy silence that followed Jamal's declaration was suddenly shattered by the chaotic murmurs of 200 guests. Women in their elegant evening gowns leaned across their tables, whispering frantically behind manicured hands. Men shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits. Jamal stood at the head table, breathing heavily, playing the role of the shattered white knight to absolute perfection. He ran a hand over his face, shaking his head as if the weight of my supposed betrayal was physically crushing him. He looked out at the sea of faces, his eyes carefully avoiding mine, and delivered a masterful performance of a loyal husband whose world had just been torn apart by a wicked, unfaithful wife. He walked around the table, taking deliberate, heavy steps toward Connor. He placed a solid, comforting hand on Connor's shoulder. Connor, taking his cue, staggered back a step, running his hands through his blonde hair, looking absolutely bewildered and devastated. It was a disgusting display of fake male solidarity. Jamal muttered loud enough for the closest tables to hear that he was deeply sorry Connor had to find out this way, but that a marriage built on my financial manipulation and deceit was doomed from the start. Jamal was laying the groundwork, painting me not just as a cheater, but as an abuser of power, a narrative I knew his lawyers would try to use to invalidate our prenuptial agreement. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of their performance, the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels echoed against the marble floor. My mother Loretta had sprung from her seat with the speed and ferocity of a woman who had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. She practically shoved the wedding planner out of her way, marching directly to the head table. She did not look at me. She did not ask for my side of the story. She bypassed me entirely and threw her arms around Jasmine. Jasmine immediately collapsed into our mother's embrace. She let out a loud theatrical wail, burying her face into the intricate lace of Loretta's designer dress. The microphone which Jasmine had conveniently left switched on, and resting on the sweetheart table picked up every single exaggerated sob, amplifying her fake agony through the massive speakers suspended from the ceiling. Loretta held Jasmine tight, stroking her hair like she was a wounded child. Then my mother turned her head slowly. The look she gave me was filled with a lifetime of resentment. Her eyes were dark, furious, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice shaking with righteous indignation. She called me a disgrace to our family name. She yelled that I was a bitter, jealous woman who could never stand to see anyone else shine. She looked over at Pastor Thomas, who was watching the scene unfold with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, and she apologized to him on my behalf. She told the entire congregation that my heart had been poisoned by greed and arrogance, and that God was finally exposing the rot inside my soul. Loretta stepped closer to my chair, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous hiss that only I and the people at the head table could hear. She told me I was a sick individual. She accused me of using the money I made from my business to buy people to control them, and now to ruin my younger sister's perfect day, because no man would ever look at me the way Connor looked at Jasmine. She demanded that I stand up, pack my things, and walk out the back doors of the country club before she called security to have me physically removed from the premises. I looked at the three of them, Jasmine peeking out from beneath my mother's arm with dry eyes and a faint smirk. Connor staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Jamal standing tall with his chest puffed out, proud of the trap he had just sprung. They expected me to break. They expected the strong, stoic black woman to finally crack under the weight of public humiliation. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw a glass, to beg for my mother's mercy, or to fiercely defend myself against the accusations. They wanted me to look crazy. They wanted to trigger an emotional outburst that they could use as proof of my guilt and instability. But forensic accountants do not deal in emotions. We deal in ledgers. We deal in indisputable facts. We find the hidden numbers, the deleted files, and the secret accounts that liars think they have buried deep enough to survive the light of day. I looked at their faces, and I felt nothing but a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. I realized in that moment that I did not owe these people my tears, and I certainly did not owe them my peace. I did not scream. I did not stand up. I did not say a single word in my defense. Instead, I reached out and picked up my crystal water glass. I brought it to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the glass, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I set the glass down gently on the white linen tablecloth, smoothing out a small wrinkle in the fabric. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my cell phone. Because I was the sole financial provider for this entire spectacle, I was the one who had negotiated the contracts with the vendors. I had paid an extra $3,000 for the premium audiovisual package, which included full control over the massive projector screens flanking the dance floor and the state-of-the-art surround sound system. The venue manager had given me the master Bluetooth access code that morning, in case I wanted to play a surprise slideshow for the bride and groom. I unlocked my screen. I swiped past my text messages and opened the venue's smart control application. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second. I looked at Jamal, who was now furrowing his brow, suddenly unsure of why I was so terrifyingly quiet. I looked at my mother, who was still glaring at me, waiting for me to run away in shame. I smiled at them, a genuine, terrifying smile. I tapped the screen, instantly overriding the DJ's control board. The ambient dinner music cut out abruptly, plunging the massive ballroom into a heavy, suffocating silence. The massive dual projector screens flanking the dance floor, which had been lowered specifically to display a montage of Jasmine and Connor's fake romance, flickered out of standby mode. I had paid an extra $1,000 for those screens so my sister could have her perfect cinematic moment. Now they were serving a much better purpose. I swiped up on my phone, casting a high-definition video file directly to the system. The screens glowed bright blue for a fraction of a second before resolving into a crystal-clear wide-angle view of my own living room. Because my forensic accounting firm deals with highly sensitive corporate audits, my home office and living areas are equipped with state-of-the-art motion-activated security cameras. My family knew about the cameras outside, but Jamal had completely forgotten about the discreet ones tucked into the interior crown molding. The timestamp on the bottom corner of the video read exactly 3 weeks ago. On the 10-foot-tall screens, the footage showed my husband Jamal and my sister Jasmine walking into my house holding half-empty glasses of my expensive imported wine. The ballroom was so quiet that the crisp audio from the video echoed perfectly off the marble walls. 200 guests watched in absolute horror as the golden child of our family set her wine glass down on my coffee table, turned around, and wrapped her arms tightly around my husband's neck. Jamal pulled her in, and right there on the custom velvet sofa I had purchased with my own hard-earned money, they began kissing passionately. A collective gasp ripped through the country club. I watched Pastor Thomas physically recoil, grabbing the edge of his table as if he had just been struck by lightning. The church elders who had been whispering about my supposed sins just moments ago were now staring at the screens with their mouths hanging open. But the physical betrayal was not even the worst part. The true audit was in the audio. It was. On the screen, Jasmine pulled back from the kiss, running her hands down Jamal's chest. Her voice, usually so sweet and innocent in front of our mother, sounded incredibly calculating. She asked him if he was absolutely sure about the timeline and if Connor would suspect anything. Jamal laughed softly on the video, a smug, arrogant sound that made my skin crawl. He pulled her back against him and spoke the words that would officially end his life as he knew it. His voice boomed over the premium surround sound speakers, filling every corner of the venue. If we frame Kiara for infidelity, my prenup payout doubles. I take the cash, leave her, and pay off Connor's debts so he marries you, then we are free and clear. The video continued to play, showing them laughing about how easy it would be to manipulate my mother into backing their story and painting me as the villain. But nobody in the ballroom was paying attention to the footage anymore. The real show was happening at the head table. The victorious expression on Jamal's face had completely evaporated, replaced by a pale, sickening terror. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He took a step back, bumping hard into the floral arrangement behind him. His eyes darted frantically around the room as he realized every single person he knew had just watched him confess to premeditated extortion and infidelity. Jasmine was frozen. Her theatrical sobs had completely vanished. She looked at our mother, expecting Loretta to somehow fix this, to somehow spin this undeniable high-definition evidence into a misunderstanding. But for the first time in her entire life, Loretta had absolutely nothing to say. My mother's face was drained of all color. The heavy layer of foundation and blush she wore could not hide the ashen, ghostly pallor of her skin. The perfect illusion she had spent decades building for our church community was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes, ignited by her precious golden child. But the most visceral reaction came from Connor. The man who had been playing the role of the devastated, betrayed groom just 60 seconds ago suddenly realized he was the ultimate punchline. He realized that the woman he was marrying and the man pretending to be his supportive brother-in-law had been using him as a pathetic financial pawn. They were planning to use my stolen money to pay off his failing tech startup debts, treating him like an oblivious prop in their twisted romance. Connor's hands began to shake violently. The blood rushed to his face, turning his skin bright red. The crystal champagne flute he had been holding slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I did not flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. I simply locked my phone, letting the giant projector screens fade to black. I calmly stood up from my chair and smoothed down the front of my silk gown. I picked up my designer clutch from the table, looking directly into Jamal's panicked eyes, and then shifted my gaze to Jasmine's terrified face. I offered them a warm, terrifyingly polite smile, and casually mentioned that they might want to check their bank balances right now, because the $50,000 catering bill for this lovely evening had not yet been settled. I turned my back on the head table and began walking toward the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom. The sea of guests parted for me instinctively. Nobody dared to make eye contact. The silence in the room was so absolute that the only sound was the rustle of my silk gown sweeping across the marble floor. I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy, suffocating mask of the dutiful daughter had finally been ripped away, and I was breathing free air. But my mother was not going to let me walk out of that room and destroy the fragile social empire she had spent her entire life cultivating. Before I could reach the heavy brass handles of the exit doors, a hand clamped down hard on my bicep. The polished fingernails dug painfully into my skin. I stopped and turned slowly. Loretta was standing there, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from her frantic sprint across the room. Her eyes were wild with a desperate, manic energy. She had completely bypassed Jamal and Jasmine, leaving them to face the furious whispers of the congregation alone, because she knew I was the only one who controlled the narrative. And more importantly, the money. She pulled me roughly into the shadowy alcove near the coat check, away from the direct line of sight of Pastor Thomas. Her voice was a ragged, venomous whisper. She demanded that I march right back up to that microphone and tell everyone it was a cruel prank. She ordered me to explain that the video was manufactured, that I had used my computer skills to create fake audio and manipulated footage just to ruin my sister's perfect day out of spite. She actually used the word deepfake, a term I was absolutely certain she had learned from watching daytime television, clinging to it like a life raft in the middle of a hurricane. She told me that if I did not fix this right now, the church community would never look at our family the same way again. She said the shame would physically kill her. I looked down at the hand still gripping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I just stared at her fingers until she felt the sheer coldness of my gaze and slowly released her grip. I asked her if she honestly believed her own lies. I kept my voice low, steady, and razor sharp. I reminded her that there would be no family name to protect if I had not been funding its existence for the last 10 years. I asked her who she thought paid the $120,000 tuition for Jasmine to attend Spelman College when her golden child lost her academic scholarship after the first semester. I asked her who paid the mortgage on her house when she maxed out her credit cards trying to keep up appearances for the church elders. I reminded her that I had just dropped $50,000 in cash on this circus of a wedding because Connor claimed his venture capital funds were temporarily frozen. I laid out the financial facts of our family with the precision of a forensic audit. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every late night I spent working while they took vacations on my dime. Instead of showing an ounce of remorse, or even acknowledging the reality of the video she had just watched, my mother doubled down. Her face twisted into a sneer of absolute disgust. She told me that money was the only thing I had to offer. She spat out the words, her voice dripping with venom, claiming that I owed Jasmine this wedding. She said I owed my sister everything because I was too obsessed with my career and too selfish to have children of my own. She told me that since I was clearly incapable of building a real family, it was my duty to provide for the sister who actually could carry on our legacy. She called me a sterile, bitter woman who was trying to buy the love that Jasmine received naturally. The words were designed to break me. They were the exact emotional daggers she had used my entire life to keep me obedient and generous. 10 minutes ago, that comment might have made me flinch. But standing there knowing exactly what Jamal and Jasmine had planned for my future, the manipulation lost all of its power. The illusion of my mother's love evaporated completely, leaving nothing but a cold, empty transaction. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my choices. I stopped walking entirely. I squared my shoulders and looked my mother dead in the eye, letting the absolute finality of the moment settle between us. I unclasped the gold latch of my designer clutch. I reached inside, bypassing my phone and my lipstick, and my fingers found the heavy, cold metal of my platinum credit card. I slowly pulled it out, holding it up so the polished silver caught the dim light of the alcove. I held the heavy platinum credit card up in the dim light of the alcove, watching my mother's eyes track the reflective metal. For a split second, a look of profound relief washed over her face. She actually thought I was going to hand it to her. She thought I was going to surrender, let her march over to the venue manager, settle the remaining balances, and buy her way out of the devastating humiliation Jasmine had just brought down on our family. She expected me to swallow my pride, as I always did, to protect her precious reputation. Instead, I gripped the card tightly between my fingers, stepped around her rigid body, and walked straight out of the alcove. I marched directly toward the center of the dance floor. The head coordinator of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Sterling, was already power walking toward the head table. He was flanked by two large security guards, his face flushed with professional panic after witnessing the scandalous video presentation and hearing the shattering of Connor's champagne flute. I intercepted him right in the middle of the monogrammed dance floor. The entire ballroom held its breath, the silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. I looked at him, my voice perfectly level, carrying easily to the surrounding tables. I told him to pull up the master invoice for the Montgomery wedding on his tablet. Mr. Sterling blinked, clearly caught off guard by my calm demeanor amid the absolute chaos, but he quickly tapped the screen of his device. I unlocked my phone and opened my private banking application. As a forensic accountant, navigating financial authorizations, pending charges, and asset freezes is quite literally my area of expertise. I knew exactly how the country club's billing system worked. I had placed a $25,000 hold on my platinum card 48 hours ago to cover the remaining venue rental time, the premium open bar tab, the midnight catered dessert buffet, and the non-refundable first-class flights to the Maldives that the travel agency had conveniently routed through the club's concierge service. I looked at Mr. Sterling and instructed him to process an immediate cancellation of the pre-authorization hold. I informed him that I was formally withdrawing all financial sponsorship for the event, effective immediately, citing documented fraud and breach of contract by the bride and groom. Mr. Sterling stared at his tablet, then looked up at me, his professional veneer cracking just slightly. He warned me, keeping his voice low, that if I released the authorized hold, the club's strict corporate policy required them to terminate the event immediately unless another form of payment was secured on the spot. I smiled, tapped the confirm button on my banking application, and slipped the phone back into my designer clutch. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to terminate it. What happened next was a masterpiece of corporate efficiency. Mr. Sterling tapped a message into his earpiece. Within 3 seconds, the romantic ambient pink and gold uplighting that bathed the ballroom in a soft fairy tale glow was abruptly cut off. It was instantly replaced by the harsh, blinding white glare of the industrial overhead maintenance lights. The sudden shift in illumination was incredibly jarring. It stripped away all the magic and romance of the evening in a single heartbeat. Under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, the towering floral centerpieces suddenly looked gaudy and overdone. The expensive silk drapery looked like cheap theater curtains. The illusion of Jasmine's perfect high society wedding was completely shattered, exposing the ugly, fractured reality underneath. Across the room, the bartenders immediately stopped pouring drinks. They began pulling the expensive bottles of imported liquor down from the illuminated shelves, locking them away in the heavy wooden cabinets beneath the bar. The servers, who had been hovering near the kitchen doors with trays of hors d'oeuvres, turned around and marched back inside. The string quartet, who had been waiting to play the first dance song, quietly began packing their instruments into their velvet-lined cases. The guests began murmuring frantically. Church elders clutched their pearls, and wealthy neighbors whispered aggressively to their spouses. Jasmine shrieked from the head table, her hands flying to her face to shield her eyes from the blinding overhead lights. Mr. Sterling stepped up to the sweetheart table. He did not use a microphone, but his trained, authoritative voice carried clearly across the silent room. He announced to the bride, the groom, and the remaining guests that the financial backing for the reception had just been formally withdrawn. He stated with absolute emotionless clarity that the event was officially concluded. The bar was closed, the food service was suspended, and everyone needed to vacate the premises within 15 minutes, unless the outstanding balance of $25,000 was settled immediately. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a fake theatrical sob this time. It was a raw, visceral scream of genuine panic. She looked wildly around the room, realizing that the people she had invited to witness her grand triumph were now watching her get evicted from her own wedding reception. Loretta came sprinting out of the coat check alcove. The sheer terror of being publicly exposed as a financial fraud in front of Pastor Thomas and her entire congregation pushed her into a state of sheer delusion. She refused to accept that the power dynamic had shifted. She refused to believe that the bank vault had finally been sealed shut. My mother scrambled past the empty tables, her high heels slipping slightly on the polished marble. She rushed directly to the head table and grabbed Connor by the arm. She physically pulled him forward, pushing him toward Mr. Sterling. Her voice was shrill, echoing with desperate arrogance. She shouted for everyone to calm down. She waved her hand dismissively at me, loudly proclaiming to the crowd that my little childish stunt meant absolutely nothing. She announced that Connor, her brilliant, wealthy tech entrepreneur son-in-law, would gladly cover the remaining balance. She patted his chest, her voice dripping with fake, sickening, sweet confidence, telling the venue manager to just bring the credit card machine over to the groom, because $25,000 was merely pocket change for a man of his incredible success. Every single eye in the ballroom locked onto Connor. Connor stood completely frozen in the harsh, unflattering light. The crisp white collar of his tuxedo shirt was rapidly soaking through with sweat. His face, which had been pale with shock just moments ago, was now flushed a deep, blotchy red. He looked like a deer trapped in the headlights of a massive, speeding freight truck. Jasmine stopped screaming and looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperate expectation. She grabbed his other arm, shaking him slightly, demanding that he pull out his wallet and shut me up. She told him to just put it on his black card and they would deal with my disrespect later. But as a forensic accountant, I knew the brutal truth about Connor's finances. I knew that his supposed tech startup had been quietly dissolved 8 months ago. I knew that he was currently dodging phone calls from 3 different debt collection agencies, and that his personal credit score was sitting at a dismal 400. I knew that the only reason he had agreed to marry my sister was because Jasmine had convinced him that my limitless bank accounts would eventually become their personal bailout fund. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. 10 seconds. Connor's chest heaved up and down. He reached a trembling, sweaty hand inside his tailored tuxedo jacket. He patted his breast pocket. He patted his pants. He was desperately stalling for time, searching for a wallet he knew perfectly well was entirely empty of anything but maxed-out, declined plastic. He looked over at Jamal, his co-conspirator, silently begging for help. But Jamal was still sitting rigidly in his chair, staring blankly at the dark projector screens, completely paralyzed by the realization that his own life was over. Connor was entirely alone, standing under the glaring lights, with a $25,000 bill hanging over his head and 200 angry guests waiting for him to produce a miracle he did not possess. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, the sound incredibly loud and authoritative in the dead silent room. He stepped slightly closer to the panicked groom and informed Connor that the Oak Ridge Country Club accepted all major credit cards, certified cashier checks, and direct wire transfers. Connor stopped patting his empty tuxedo pockets. His shoulders slumped forward in absolute defeat. The wealthy, confident illusion he had carefully maintained for my mother and sister for the past year completely shattered under the harsh fluorescent maintenance lights. He looked at Jasmine, then at my horrified mother, and finally his gaze dropped to the polished marble floor. His voice trembled as he spoke. He admitted loud enough for the first few rows of guest tables to hear that he did not have the money. Jasmine let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. She grabbed his arm and shook it, telling him to stop making bad jokes because the venue manager was being serious. But Connor pulled his arm away from her grip with a look of utter exhaustion. The dam broke, and the pathetic truth spilled out of him in a rush of panicked, breathless words. He confessed that his highly touted venture capital tech startup had quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 8 months ago. His angel investors had pulled out his corporate assets, had been entirely liquidated to pay off vendors, and he was currently living off a high-interest personal loan that was practically drained. He admitted his credit score was sitting at a dismal 400, and the prestigious black credit card Jasmine was always bragging about to her friends had been forcibly deactivated by the bank weeks ago. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jasmine stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck across the face. The perfectly poised, elegant bride vanished in an instant, replaced by a furious, hysterical woman who realized she had just legally bound herself to a sinking financial ship. She began screaming at him right there on the monogram dance floor. She shrieked that he was a liar and a disgusting fraud, demanding to know how he could do this to her in front of her family and friends. The irony of the situation was so rich it was practically suffocating. The woman who had just been caught on a high-definition security camera, plotting to extort my money to pay off her broke groom, was now playing the devastated victim of his deception. Behind them, the country club was descending into absolute social chaos. The church elders and the prominent families of our congregation did not waste a single second processing the shock. I watched as dozens of glowing smartphone screens lit up the dim edges of the room. The church gossips were already furiously texting the rest of the congregation who had not attended the reception. Whispers spread like wildfire across the tables. People were pointing, gasping, and shaking their heads in sheer disbelief at the mighty, embarrassing fall of Loretta's precious golden child. My mother looked like she was about to suffer a medical emergency. She grabbed the edge of a guest table to steady herself, gasping for air, as she watched the affluent, respectable image she had sacrificed my entire life to build crumble into absolute dust. She had eagerly pushed Jasmine into the arms of a bankrupt con artist, simply because he was a white man who looked the part of a tech billionaire, and now the entire church community was watching the humiliating aftermath live and in person. Mr. Sterling did not have time for family drama. He signaled his security team. They stepped forward, their presence large and intimidating, and politely but firmly instructed the guests to begin moving toward the coat check and the main exits. The party was officially over, and the eviction process had begun. I stood near the edge of the dance floor watching the glorious, catastrophic collapse of their grand plan. I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The parasites who had fed on my hard work for over a decade were finally turning on each other. I adjusted the strap of my designer clutch, ready to walk out the front doors, call my town car, and never look back. But Jamal was not finished. The initial shock that had paralyzed my husband finally wore off, instantly replaced by a dark, desperate, and violent rage. He had just watched his entire future go up in flames on those projector screens. The double payout he was banking on from our prenuptial agreement was gone. The secret luxury apartment he was funding with stolen money was exposed. The grand new life he had plotted with my sister was completely destroyed. And he knew that the only person holding the keys to his financial survival, the only person who could stop the impending legal slaughter, was me. I saw him moving out of the corner of my eye. He shoved roughly past a group of retreating guests, his face twisted in a mask of pure anger. Before I could turn to walk away, Jamal closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. His large hand shot out and clamped down onto my upper arm with bruising force. His fingers dug deeply into my skin, entirely dropping the gentle, sophisticated corporate manager persona he always wore for the public. He leaned in close, his breath hot against the side of my face, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He told me I was going to fix this mess right now. I tried to yank my arm away, but his grip was like a steel vise. He did not care that people were watching. He did not care about the venue staff or the whispering church elders. Operating purely on the panicked adrenaline of a cornered predator, Jamal jerked me forward. He dragged me aggressively away from the chaotic main floor, pulling me down a dimly lit hallway and shoving me into an empty VIP bridal dressing room so he could handle me in private. The heavy mahogany door of the VIP bridal dressing room slammed shut with a definitive thud, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the ruined reception outside. Jamal locked the deadbolt. The room was a stark contrast to the ugly reality unfolding between us. It was a luxurious suite, flooded with bright, unforgiving light from the massive vanity mirrors. Discarded makeup brushes, half-empty champagne glasses, and tufts of white tulle were scattered across the plush velvet seating. It was the exact room where I had stood just hours earlier, paying the final invoice for Jasmine's hair and makeup team. Jamal released my arm with a violent shove that sent me stumbling back a few steps until my hips hit the edge of a marble makeup counter. I caught my balance smoothing down the front of my silk gown and looked up at the man I had married 5 years ago. The devastated, heartbroken husband persona he had so masterfully projected in the ballroom was completely gone. The fake tears had dried instantly. The slumped, defeated posture was replaced by an aggressive, predatory stance. His chest was puffed out, his jaw was clenched tight, and the veins in his neck were bulging against the collar of his expensive tuxedo. This was the real Jamal. This was the arrogant, entitled man who believed he was the smartest person in any room, especially when that room only contained his wife. He took 2 menacing steps toward me, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me back into submission. He pointed a thick finger just inches from my face and began barking orders. His voice was a harsh, guttural command. He told me I was going to unlock the door, walk right back out onto that dance floor, and tell the venue manager that my little financial temper tantrum was over. He demanded that I hand over a new credit card, turn the music back on, and apologize to everyone for letting my wicked jealousy ruin his innocent reputation. He actually had the audacity to tell me that if I acted quickly enough, I might be able to salvage a shred of my dignity before the church community completely ostracized me. I stood perfectly still, my back resting against the cold marble counter. I did not shrink away from him. I did not let my eyes dart toward the locked door. I simply stared at him, observing his erratic behavior with the clinical detachment of an auditor examining a fraudulent spreadsheet. I let the silence stretch between us. I wanted him to hear his own heavy, panicked breathing. I wanted him to feel the absolute lack of fear radiating from my side of the room. My silence infuriated him. He interpreted my calm demeanor as defiance, which only fueled his misplaced confidence. He let out a harsh, mocking scoff and took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. He decided that physical intimidation was not working, so he shifted his strategy to the one arena he believed he completely controlled. He decided to threaten my life's work. Jamal began to pace across the plush carpet of the dressing room, running a hand over his freshly faded haircut. He dropped his voice into a smug, conversational tone that was somehow even more repulsive than his shouting. He told me that I had made a massive miscalculation tonight. He said that by airing our dirty laundry in public, I had given him the perfect ammunition to destroy me in divorce court. He smiled a nasty, victorious smirk, twisting his handsome features, and told me that his lawyers were going to absolutely tear my forensic accounting firm apart piece by piece. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious greed. He gloated that I had been so busy building my precious 7-figure consulting empire that I had forgotten the fundamental rules of marriage. He reminded me with absolute supreme arrogance that we lived in a state governed by strict property laws. He confidently threw around the term community property, claiming that because he had supported me emotionally during the growth of my business, he was legally entitled to exactly 50% of everything I had built. He leaned back against the locked door, crossing his ankles, thoroughly enjoying the sound of his own voice. He brought up the prenuptial agreement we had signed 5 years ago. He called it a basic boilerplate contract that any competent lawyer could rip to shreds in an afternoon. He laughed, claiming that the infidelity clause I had insisted upon was completely unenforceable because I had just publicly humiliated him, which constituted severe emotional abuse. He laid out his grand master plan right there in the dressing room. He was going to file for an emergency injunction on Monday morning, freeze all of my corporate operating accounts, and drag my pristine business reputation through months of grueling legal discovery until I begged him to settle. He promised me that he would walk away from this marriage with half of my firm, the luxury cars I had purchased, and a massive alimony check that would easily fund his new life with my sister. He told me that I was a brilliant accountant, but a profoundly stupid wife. I listened to every single word he said. I listened to him construct a fantasy future built entirely on a foundation of profound legal ignorance and blinding male hubris. He actually believed he had outsmarted a woman whose literal profession was dismantling complex financial fraud. He thought he could outmaneuver someone who tracked offshore accounts and exposed corporate embezzlement for a living. The sheer staggering magnitude of his stupidity was almost breathtaking. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I reacted. I laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh. It was not a nervous giggle or a defensive scoff. It was a cold, deep, and genuinely amused laugh that bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. The sound echoed off the vanity mirrors sharp and completely unexpected. Jamal flinched. His smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He uncrossed his arms, pushing himself off the door. He demanded to know what was so funny, his voice losing its confident edge. He told me I was crazy, that the shock of the evening had finally broken my mind. I did not answer him immediately. I stopped laughing, a chilling smile settling onto my face. Earlier that afternoon, before the ceremony began, I had secured my large leather work briefcase in the bottom drawer of the vanity I was currently leaning against. I turned around, opened the heavy wooden drawer, and reached inside. I bypassed my laptop and my spare flats. My fingers wrapped around the smooth, heavy material of a beautifully bound, thick red folder. I pulled the folder out and turned back to face the man who thought he was going to take half of my empire. I held the bright red folder in my hands, tapping the edge thoughtfully against the marble counter, and prepared to show my husband exactly what happens when you try to audit the auditor. I held the heavy, bright red folder in my hands, feeling the substantial weight of the glossy paper inside. I tapped the edge thoughtfully against the cold marble counter, watching Jamal's eyes track the movement. A sudden, sharp flicker of uncertainty finally broke through his arrogant facade. I asked him, my voice dangerously calm, if he actually remembered what I do for a living. I asked him if he honestly thought my job consisted of just balancing checkbooks and filling out tax returns, which was the incredibly reductive way he usually described my career to his golf buddies. I reminded him that my official title is Senior Forensic Accountant. I run a highly specialized firm dedicated to uncovering corporate fraud, executing complex asset tracing, and completely dismantling the hidden financial webs created by men who are significantly smarter than him. I stepped away from the marble vanity and walked slowly toward the center of the dressing room. A plush velvet chaise lounge sat under a sparkling crystal chandelier with a low glass coffee table positioned right in front of it. I tossed the thick red folder onto the glass surface. The heavy, authoritative thud echoed loudly in the quiet room. I stepped back, crossed my arms over my chest, and gestured toward the table with a nod of my head. I told him to open it. Jamal hesitated, his broad shoulders visibly tensed. The absolute certainty he had possessed just moments ago was rapidly draining from his posture. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against the tight collar of his pristine white tuxedo shirt. He took 2 slow, cautious steps forward, leaning over the glass table. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached out and flipped open the heavy red cardstock cover. The very first page was a comprehensive executive summary meticulously organized with color-coded tabs and highlighted figures. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the top paragraph, and I witnessed the exact moment his entire world collapsed. The warm brown complexion of his face turned an ashen, sickly gray. Since he was clearly struggling to process the information, I generously decided to narrate the contents for him. I kept my tone perfectly conversational, as if I were delivering a quarterly earnings report to a board of directors. I explained that I had spent the last 6 months conducting a full-scale, legally compliant, and deeply thorough audit of his entire financial existence. I told him I had easily found the ridiculous little shell company he set up in Delaware. I detailed how I had tracked the offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, the exact accounts where he had been quietly siphoning funds from our joint savings over the past year. I recited the specific dates, the IP addresses he used from his home office, and the exact wire transfer routing numbers. I explained that he had left a digital footprint so massive and sloppy that a first-year accounting intern could have flagged it. Jamal was breathing heavily now, his fingers gripping the edges of the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. But hiding marital assets in anticipation of a divorce was merely a civil matter. I was just getting warmed up. I instructed him to turn to tab 3. I told him that tab 3 was where his spectacular stupidity officially graduated from a standard marital dispute to a federal crime. I explained that when I first noticed the glaring discrepancies in his reported income and his sudden lavish spending habits, I naturally expanded my audit to include his employer Vanguard Logistics. As a senior corporate manager, Jamal had direct authorization over high-level vendor payments and operational budgets. It was a position of immense trust which he had completely violated. I laid out the undeniable paper trail right there on the pages in front of him. I showed him exactly how I had documented his creation of 3 phantom vendor accounts. I detailed how he had systematically forged invoices for consulting services that were never rendered, and how he had successfully funneled exactly $150,000 of stolen corporate money directly into a shadow bank account under a fake name. His knees practically buckled. He sank down onto the edge of the velvet chaise lounge, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the copied bank statements, the forged digital signatures, and the direct deposit receipts that unequivocally proved his guilt. I took a step closer, towering over him, and lowered my voice to a sharp, cutting whisper. I told him I knew exactly where every single penny of that stolen corporate money went. I recited the purchases from memory. $42,000 spent at a boutique jeweler to buy a custom diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. The exact same luxury watch that Jasmine was currently wearing on her wrist out in the ballroom while she cried about her ruined wedding. $80,000 used to secure a 2-year prepaid lease on a spectacular penthouse apartment in Midtown Atlanta. The secret love nest he and my sister had meticulously decorated, the very place they planned to move into immediately after draining my business accounts and destroying my life. I listed the expensive steakhouse dinners, the luxury hotel rooms they booked during his supposed business trips, and the designer handbags he had showered her with. I told him I had every single receipt, every camera timestamp, and every corresponding signature. I had built a watertight case that any federal prosecutor would consider an absolute gift. Jamal tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading desperately, trying to salvage any remaining leverage. He stammered weakly, his voice cracking, attempting to fall back on his previous threat. He whispered that we were still married, that community property laws still applied, and that my money was his money. I instantly shut that down. I let out a sharp sigh of disappointment, mocking his lack of legal comprehension. I reminded him of the specific ironclad fraud and criminal liability clauses deeply embedded in our prenuptial agreement. I explained that by committing felony embezzlement, actively engaging in wire fraud, and utilizing our shared marital funds to conduct criminal activities, he had completely and permanently voided any claim he ever had to my assets. He was not walking away with half of my consulting firm. He was not walking away with the house, the cars, or the investment portfolios. He was walking away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a massive legal defense bill he could no longer afford. The brutal reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He dropped the red folder back onto the glass table, burying his face in his hands. He began to hyperventilate. The arrogant, imposing man who had just threatened to drag my pristine reputation through the mud was now reduced to a trembling, broken shell. He suddenly lunged forward, falling off the edge of the velvet chaise lounge and landing heavily on his knees right in front of me. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my silk gown, his face stained with real tears this time. He begged me. He completely abandoned his pride and pleaded with me to keep this between us. He promised to leave the house quietly tonight. He swore he would sign a full, uncontested divorce agreement by Monday morning. He promised to walk away from Jasmine, to disappear from my life entirely, and to never ask me for a single dime as long as I promised not to take that red folder to the police. He looked up at me, practically sobbing, swearing that federal prison would kill him. I looked down at the man who had plotted to destroy my life, strip me of my hard-earned wealth, and leave me humiliated in front of my entire community. I felt absolutely no pity. I offered him that chilling, genuine smile once again. I reached down and gently pried his sweaty fingers off the expensive silk fabric of my dress. I stepped back, adjusting my posture, looking at him with the cold detachment of an executioner. I calmly informed him that his generous offer of an uncontested divorce was a few hours too late. I told him that I did not bring the original documents to the country club. I explained that before I even sat down to get my makeup done for this wedding, I had already placed 3 exact copies of that thick red folder into priority overnight FedEx envelopes. I watched his eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated terror as I delivered the final crushing blow. I smiled sweetly and told him that the first envelope was currently sitting on the desk of the chief executive officer at Vanguard Logistics. The second envelope was already in the hands of the federal authorities, and the third envelope was rapidly making its way to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The absolute finality of my words struck Jamal with the force of a physical blow. The last remnants of his arrogant posture vanished completely. His knees gave out and he collapsed backward into a plush velvet accent chair, hitting the cushion so hard the wooden frame groaned in protest. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw slack, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was no longer a confident corporate manager, scheming for a massive divorce settlement. He was a terrified criminal realizing he was about to trade his tailored Italian suits for a federal prison uniform. The reality of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation seizing his assets, freezing his bank accounts, and dragging him out of his office in handcuffs finally broke his mind. He pulled at his hair, muttering to himself, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. I stood over him, feeling nothing but a profound sense of satisfaction. I had meticulously engineered his downfall, and watching the house of cards collapse was worth every single sleepless night I spent tracking his offshore accounts. I reached down to pick up my red folder from the glass table, ready to leave him to rot in his own despair. But before my fingers could graze the heavy cardstock cover, the thick mahogany door of the dressing room rattled violently. Someone twisted the brass handle with frantic, aggressive force. Jamal had locked the deadbolt, but a second later, the sharp click of a master key echoed through the room. A terrified-looking venue security guard pushed the door open, intending to tell us we needed to vacate the property immediately. He was violently shoved aside by Connor. My new brother-in-law burst into the VIP dressing room looking absolutely deranged. The pristine white collar of his tuxedo shirt was completely unbuttoned. His expensive silk bow tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was flushed a dangerous mottled red. His chest was heaving, his fists were clenched at his sides, and his eyes darted wildly between me, the red folder on the table, and the pathetic broken man sitting in the velvet chair. Connor had been standing right outside the door. He had followed us down the hallway after his humiliating financial confession on the dance floor, desperately hoping Jamal was going to intimidate me into handing over a new credit card to save the night. Instead, he had pressed his ear to the wood and heard every single word of my forensic audit. He had heard Jamal confess to embezzlement. He had heard the absolute confirmation that there would be no massive $1 million divorce payout. The realization that his grand financial bailout was completely dead hit Connor like a freight train. He marched across the room, completely ignoring me, and grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo jacket. He yanked Jamal halfway out of the chair, his face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. He screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, demanding to know if it was all a lie. He shook Jamal violently, asking him where the money was, where the guaranteed settlement they had planned on using to pay off his bankruptcy debts had gone. Jamal did not even try to fight back. He just stared blankly at Connor's chest, his arms hanging limply at his sides, completely unresponsive. He was in a state of clinical shock. Connor shoved Jamal back into the chair in absolute disgust. He took a staggering step backward, running both hands violently through his blonde hair. He began pacing the small floor space, muttering frantically about his aggressive debt collectors, his ruined credit score, and the terrifying legal binding of his brand new marriage certificate. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly clicking together in his mind. He realized that Jasmine had never loved him. He realized that my sister and my husband had carefully selected him because he was a broke, desperate white man who presented the perfect wealthy illusion for my mother's church friends. They needed a disposable prop to legitimize Jasmine's sudden leap into high society, and they had played him for an absolute fool. Connor stopped pacing. He slowly turned his head, looking out the open doorway toward the brightly lit lobby where the remaining guests were still gathered. A dark, chaotic energy settled over his features. The humiliation he had suffered under the maintenance lights of the ballroom was nothing compared to the anger radiating from him right now. He had just legally bound himself to a woman with no money, no morals, and a secret lover who was heading straight to federal prison. He did not say another word to Jamal. He did not look at me. He simply turned on his heel and stormed out of the VIP dressing room, his heavy footsteps echoing aggressively down the hallway. I picked up my red folder, tucked it securely under my arm, and followed him at a calm, measured pace. I was not going to miss the grand finale. When I emerged from the hallway into the grand marble lobby, the scene was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The country club security guards were actively herding the last of the church elders toward the exit doors. My mother, Loretta, was standing near the coat check, frantically grabbing the arm of Pastor Thomas. She was practically hyperventilating, begging the pastor to pray over our family, desperately trying to spin the catastrophic evening as a spiritual attack designed to ruin a holy union. Jasmine was standing right beside her, furiously typing on her phone, likely trying to secure a last-minute hotel room since their luxury honeymoon flights to the Maldives had just been abruptly canceled by my bank. Connor did not slow down. He marched directly into the center of the lobby, shoved a towering floral arrangement out of his way, and completely shattered the hushed, nervous murmurs of the crowd. He pointed directly at Jasmine and let out a roar of pure fury. He screamed her name, demanding that she look him in the eyes. Jasmine dropped her phone. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, her mouth falling open in shock as she took in the sight of her disheveled, furious husband. Pastor Thomas took a quick step back, alarmed by the sheer aggression radiating from Connor. Connor closed the distance between them, ignoring my mother's frantic attempts to step in and calm him down. Loretta tried to grab his arm, hissing at him to keep his voice down and remember where he was, but Connor easily shook her off. He stood just inches from Jasmine's face and demanded to know the truth right in front of the pastor and the remaining congregation. He screamed, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings, asking her if she had just used him for an expensive wedding photo shoot. He demanded to know if she had forced him to stand at an altar and vow his life to her in front of hundreds of people, all while she was secretly sleeping with her sister's husband. He did not wait for her to answer. He turned his back on her and faced the crowd, gesturing wildly toward the hallway where Jamal was still hiding in the dressing room. He announced to everyone that Jasmine and Jamal had been sleeping together for months. He exposed their entire plot to extort my business assets to fund their sick, twisted romance. He told the church elders that my mother's perfect golden child was nothing but a manipulative fraud who had dragged him into a fake marriage just to secure a massive financial payout that did not even exist. Jasmine's face drained of all color. She looked around the lobby, making desperate eye contact with the women who had praised her beauty and grace just hours earlier. But there was no sympathy left in their eyes. There was only disgust, judgment, and the absolute certainty that the golden child of our community was completely ruined. What will happen when the church community finally turns their back on my mother? Tell me what you think in the comments below. The echo of Connor's furious voice still hung in the air of the country club lobby. He had laid the ugly truth bare for the entire congregation to see, and the immediate aftermath was a masterclass in social destruction. The church elders, the women who had spent the last decade treating my mother like royalty and my sister like an angel, were now looking at them with thinly veiled disgust. The pristine reputation my mother had sacrificed my sanity to build was actively dissolving into the polished marble floor. But Loretta was not going down without a fight. In our community, when the undeniable truth backs you into a corner, toxic parents often pull their final, most manipulative trump card. They weaponize religion. I watched my mother's eyes dart frantically around the lobby until they locked onto Pastor Thomas. She practically threw herself across the room, grabbing the sleeve of his tailored suit. She began to weep loudly, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. She dragged the bewildered pastor through the crowd, pointing a shaking finger directly at me as I stood calmly near the coat check with my red folder tucked under my arm. She cried out that the devil had infiltrated her family tonight. She told the pastor that I had orchestrated this entire nightmare because I could not bear to see my younger sister happy. She claimed that Connor's outburst was just the result of the vicious lies I had planted in his head. It was an astonishing display of delusion. Even after watching the high-definition video of Jasmine and Jamal kissing in my living room, my mother was desperately trying to rewrite reality and cast me as the ultimate villain. Pastor Thomas stepped forward. He was a tall, imposing man who was entirely used to having his authority respected without question. He adjusted the lapels of his suit, cleared his throat, and looked down at me with an expression of profound spiritual disappointment. He did not ask me if I was okay. He did not ask me how I was handling the devastating discovery that my husband of 5 years was plotting to steal my company and run away with my sister. Instead, he immediately went to work protecting the institution. He lowered his voice into his signature booming pulpit register, the tone he used every Sunday to command the room. He called me Sister Kiara, heavily emphasizing the title to remind me of my subordinate place in his flock. He told me that anger is a poison that destroys the vessel it is stored in. He quoted scripture reminding me that love covers a multitude of sins and that sweeping family matters into the public square was a direct violation of our Christian duty to protect each other. He told me that my actions tonight were bringing terrible shame not just to my mother, but to the entire church community. He insisted that I needed to swallow my pride, step into a private room with my family, and begin the hard work of forgiveness before the damage became permanent. It was the exact same speech I had heard 1,000 times growing up. It was the toxic generational script used to silence victims, protect abusers, and maintain the fragile illusion of the perfect family. Right on cue, my mother escalated her performance. She suddenly gasped for air, clutching her chest right over her heart, as if she were experiencing a sudden medical emergency. She swayed slightly, forcing Pastor Thomas to quickly put an arm around her shoulder to keep her steady. She leaned heavily against him, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She sobbed into the pastor's shoulder, loudly lamenting that she had failed as a mother. She wailed that she did not know the cold, ruthless woman standing in front of her. She told the pastor that the moment my accounting firm took off and the money started rolling in my heart had completely hardened to the Lord. She claimed that my financial independence had made me arrogant, cruel, and completely incapable of showing grace. She demanded between dramatic, heaving breaths that I drop to my knees right there in the country club lobby and repent for the sheer wickedness of humiliating my sister on her wedding day. A few of the older church mothers nodded in agreement, murmuring softly. They were so conditioned to respect the hierarchy of age and the authority of the pastor that they were actually willing to ignore the objective criminal fraud Jamal and Jasmine had committed, simply because I was refusing to play the role of the quiet, suffering wife. They expected me to bow my head, accept the spiritual reprimand, and fall back in line to save my mother from further embarrassment. I did not bow my head. I did not look down at the floor. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back completely, rejecting the heavy blanket of guilt they were trying to throw over me. I looked at my mother, who was peeking at me through her fake tears, waiting for me to break. Then I shifted my gaze directly to Pastor Thomas. I looked at the heavy gold cross resting against his chest and the expensive tailored suit he was wearing. I kept my voice incredibly calm, clear, and loud enough for the whispering congregation to hear every single syllable. I told the pastor that I found his sudden passion for transparency and family morality absolutely fascinating. I said it was incredible how quickly he was willing to condemn my financial success as a hardened sin, considering how happily the church accepted the fruits of my labor. Pastor Thomas furrowed his brow, his authoritative posture faltering slightly. He told me not to speak to him with disrespect, warning me that the Lord sees the arrogance in my heart. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute ice in my tone made several people in the crowd physically step back. I asked him a very simple, direct question. I asked Pastor Thomas if he remembered the massive building fund drive the church held last month to renovate the sanctuary. I asked him if he recalled the special Sunday service where he called my mother up to the altar to publicly praise her for becoming a platinum tier donor. My mother stopped crying instantly. Her hands dropped from her chest, and the fake heart attack miraculously cured itself in a fraction of a second. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror. I locked eyes with the pastor and asked him if he knew exactly where Loretta had gotten the $20,000 cashier's check she had so proudly dropped into the offering plate to get her name engraved in gold letters on the new sanctuary doors. Pastor Thomas looked at me, his authoritative expression faltering as a wave of genuine confusion washed over his face. He looked down at my mother, who was now trembling uncontrollably beside him, and then looked back at me. He cleared his throat, his booming voice suddenly sounding entirely unsure of itself. He stated that Sister Loretta had testified before the entire congregation that the money was a miraculous financial blessing. He said she had claimed it was the payout from a long-term, highly successful investment portfolio that her late husband had set up for her decades ago. He told me that she had given the money to the church with a pure heart to honor God and build up the community. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the country club lobby. I looked around at the church elders, the women in their expensive hats and tailored suits, who had spent the last 10 years looking down their noses at me while praising my mother's boundless faith. They were all leaning in now, their eyes wide, completely captivated by the sudden destruction of the social hierarchy they held so dear. I turned my attention back to the pastor and delivered the brutal, unvarnished truth. I told him that there was no miraculous blessing. There was no secret investment portfolio. I explained that my mother had spent her entire adult life treating her finances like a vanity project, prioritizing designer clothes, luxury cars, and high society church functions over actual financial stability. I laid out the timeline for everyone in the room to hear. I reminded the congregation of how 3 years ago Jasmine suddenly moved into a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown Atlanta. I reminded them of how Jasmine showed up to Sunday service driving a brand new, fully loaded Mercedes-Benz, claiming she had landed a massive brand partnership for her non-existent lifestyle blog. I reminded the church mothers of how Loretta had proudly strutted through the sanctuary aisles, boasting that the Lord was opening the windows of heaven to bless her beautiful, faithful youngest daughter. I looked directly at my mother. Her eyes were darting frantically, silently begging me to stop talking. But the time for protecting her fragile ego had passed years ago. I raised my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the lobby could hear the reality of her grand illusion. I announced that the windows of heaven had absolutely nothing to do with it. I revealed that to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle and maintain her own desperate need to appear wealthy, Loretta had secretly taken out a massive predatory reverse mortgage on the 4-bedroom colonial house she had lived in for the past 30 years. She had systematically drained every single ounce of equity out of the only valuable asset our family possessed. The church elders gasped in unison. The murmurs grew louder, filled with instant, sharp judgment. In our community, pretending to have money you did not actually possess was an embarrassing offense, but lying to the pastor and the church board about the source of a major donation was a social death sentence. I did not stop there. I explained the mechanics of her catastrophic financial decision with the cold clinical precision of an auditor. I detailed how she had taken the maximum cash advances allowed by the lender. She had handed hundreds of thousands of dollars directly to Jasmine, funding my sister's designer wardrobe, her international vacations, and the carefully curated illusion that made her an attractive target for a supposed tech entrepreneur like Connor. I told the crowd that my mother had literally mortgaged her own shelter, her own future, simply to buy her golden child a seat at the high society table. And then I addressed the $20,000 church donation. I looked Pastor Thomas dead in the eye and told him that the check he so proudly accepted was the very last drop of equity wrung from a completely dry sponge. I explained that my mother had written that check not out of faith, but out of profound toxic pride. She had drained the last available funds from the reverse mortgage just to buy the platinum tier donor status. She had sacrificed her own financial survival just so she could sit at the head table during the church banquet and feel superior to the women she was secretly out borrowing. It was blood money borrowed against a house she no longer legally controlled. Pastor Thomas instinctively took a physical step away from my mother. The movement was subtle, but in the language of church politics it was deafening. He was actively distancing himself from the taint of her fraud. He looked at Loretta with a mixture of pity and intense disapproval, the exact look she had always feared the most. But the financial autopsy was not yet complete. I still had to deliver the final fatal blow. I shifted the heavy red folder I was holding under my arm. While the bulk of the documents inside were dedicated to Jamal's corporate embezzlement, I am a forensic accountant who leaves absolutely nothing to chance. When I run an asset check on my husband, I run an asset check on my entire immediate network. I opened the red folder, bypassed the color-coded bank statements detailing my husband's crimes, and pulled out a single stark black and white legal document. I held the crisp sheet of paper up in the air. I announced to the silent lobby that because my mother had taken all the cash up front and completely failed to maintain the property taxes and the required baseline insurance payments for the last 8 months, the bank had formally accelerated the loan. I read the bold print at the top of the page out loud. It was a formal notice of default and intention to sell. I looked down at my mother, who was now swaying on her feet, completely unsupported by the pastor. I delivered the reality check she had been running from for almost a year. I told her and the entire captive audience that the bank was officially foreclosing on her home. I stated the exact date printed on the legal notice. Her house, the pristine brick colonial where she had hosted so many pretentious church gatherings, was going up for public auction on the county courthouse steps in exactly 14 days. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The illusion was completely shattered. The grand, wealthy matriarch of the family was instantly reduced to an impending homeless statistic. The church gossips did not even bother whispering anymore. They were openly staring at her, their faces reflecting a brutal combination of shock and self-righteous condemnation. The pedestal she had spent her entire life building had completely pulverized beneath her feet. Stripped of her pristine image, the heavy armor of her arrogance finally cracked. The fake theatrical tears she had been using to manipulate the pastor vanished instantly, replaced by a visceral, terrifying panic. Her breathing became ragged and shallow. The reality of her situation, the absolute certainty that she was going to lose her home, her status, and her entire social circle in a matter of days, finally crashed down upon her. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor of the country club lobby. The heavy thud of her knees hitting the stone echoed sharply, but she did not look at me. She did not apologize for the decades of financial abuse, and she did not ask me for forgiveness for trying to ruin my life just moments ago. Her toxic survival instinct bypassed me entirely. Instead, my mother turned her tear-streaked, terrified face toward the only person she believed she had saved. She turned to the golden child. Loretta crawled forward on her hands and knees, completely abandoning whatever shred of dignity she had left. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed fistfuls of the heavy, expensive silk fabric of Jasmine's $15,000 wedding dress. She clung to her youngest daughter's skirt like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. She looked up at Jasmine, her face contorted in sheer agony, and begged her beloved golden child to help her. My mother remained on the cold marble floor of the country club lobby, her fingers desperately digging into the layers of white silk, an imported tool of Jasmine's designer wedding dress. She looked up at the daughter she had worshipped since birth, her face completely stripped of the arrogant pride she had worn like armor for my entire life. Tears streamed through her heavy makeup, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. She was hyperventilating, begging Jasmine to tell everyone that it was going to be okay. She pleaded with her golden child to let her move into the luxury downtown penthouse, the secret apartment Jamal had been funding with his embezzled corporate money. Loretta was operating on pure blind desperation, still clinging to the delusion that Jasmine would gladly sacrifice her own comfort to save the mother who had sacrificed everything for her. Jasmine stood perfectly still under the glowing chandeliers. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stared down at the weeping woman clutching her knees. The church elders watched in absolute silence. Pastor Thomas held his breath. Everyone expected the beautiful, charming bride to drop to the floor, wrap her arms around her devastated mother, and promise that they would get through this terrible financial nightmare together. Instead, a look of profound, visceral disgust washed over Jasmine's face. She did not reach down to comfort her mother. She did not offer a single word of reassurance. Jasmine looked at Loretta with the exact same cold, calculating contempt she had always reserved for me. The mask of the sweet, innocent youngest daughter completely shattered, revealing the entitled, deeply narcissistic monster my mother had spent 32 years creating. Jasmine grabbed the heavy silk fabric of her skirt and violently yanked it out of Loretta's desperate grip. The sudden, aggressive motion threw my mother off balance, causing her to slump forward against the polished stone floor. Jasmine took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between herself and the profound embarrassment of her bankrupt mother. She looked down at Loretta, her voice dripping with absolute venom, and delivered a line so incredibly callous that several of the older women in the lobby audibly gasped. She told her mother that she was not moving into any apartment. She stated, her tone flat and devoid of any human empathy, that the bank foreclosure was absolutely not her problem. She looked at the woman who had literally traded her own shelter to buy her designer shoes, and she coldly reminded Loretta that she was the only one who had signed those reverse mortgage papers. Jasmine did not stop there. The sheer panic of her own ruined life caused her to lash out with breathtaking cruelty. She raised her voice, ensuring that every single member of the congregation heard exactly how little she valued the sacrifices made for her. She blamed my mother for the entire catastrophe. She yelled that she had never forced Loretta to take out a predatory loan. She accused her mother of remortgaging the house simply because Loretta was obsessed with showing off to the church board and desperately wanted to pretend they were wealthy. She told Loretta that she was a pathetic, foolish old woman for risking her own home, and she explicitly warned her mother not to drag her down into this embarrassing financial mess. The absolute silence in the lobby returned, but this time it was heavy with shock and revulsion. My mother stayed on the floor, her hands resting flat against the cold marble. She stopped crying. She stopped hyperventilating. The frantic, desperate energy completely drained out of her body, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing stillness. She slowly raised her head and looked at Jasmine. She stared into the cold, resentful eyes of her beloved youngest daughter, and I watched the exact moment her entire psychological universe collapsed inward. The ultimate realization hit Loretta with the devastating force of a physical blow. The daughter she had pampered, protected, and elevated above all else did not care about her at all. Jasmine viewed her not as a mother, but as a heavily exhausted ATM machine. The moment the funds ran dry, the moment Loretta became a liability instead of an asset, Jasmine discarded her without a second thought. All the years of extreme favoritism, all the cruel things Loretta had said to me to protect Jasmine's fragile ego, all the debt she had accumulated to keep her golden child happy, had yielded absolutely zero loyalty. Slowly, Loretta turned her head away from Jasmine. She looked across the lobby, Past the judging faces of the church elders, past the disappointed gaze of Pastor Thomas, until her eyes locked onto mine. I was standing near the coat check, perfectly composed in my custom silk gown, the thick red folder containing the absolute destruction of my husband's life, tucked securely under my arm. I looked back at her with calm, steady detachment. In that fleeting moment of eye contact, the brutal irony of her life choices finally registered in my mother's mind. The daughter she had emotionally abused, the daughter she had constantly belittled for prioritizing education over socializing, the daughter she had called selfish and bitter, just 20 minutes ago in the hallway, was the only reason she had not been living on the streets for the last 10 years. I was the one who paid the bills. I was the one who kept the lights on. I was the one who funded the illusion of her perfect life. She had traded the absolute loyalty of a daughter who built a 7-figure empire for the toxic manipulation of a daughter who could not even afford her own wedding dress. Loretta opened her mouth to speak. Her lips trembled. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unadulterated remorse in my mother's eyes. She raised a shaking hand toward me, a silent, pathetic plea for forgiveness from the only person left who possessed the power to save her. But I had already closed the vault. I did not blink. I did not offer her a reassuring smile. I simply adjusted my grip on my designer clutch and looked away completely, severing the emotional chain she had kept wrapped around my neck for over 3 decades. The congregation began to back away toward the grand exit doors. The drama had escalated far beyond a scandalous church gossip topic. It had morphed into a dark, deeply uncomfortable tragedy, and nobody wanted to be standing near the blast radius when the final pieces fell. Pastor Thomas turned his back on my mother, signaling to the remaining elders that it was time to leave this broken family to their own devices. I took a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air of the lobby, preparing to walk out those heavy brass doors and step into my waiting town car. The evening was over. The truth was out. My assets were secured, and the parasites who had fed on my hard work were completely ruined. But a cornered animal is always the most dangerous right before it is put down. A sudden, terrifying sound shattered the quiet murmur of the departing crowd. It was a guttural, feral scream of absolute rage. The heavy wooden doors leading to the hallway of the VIP dressing rooms burst violently open, the brass handles slamming hard against the plaster walls. Jamal exploded into the lobby. The sophisticated, charming corporate manager was entirely gone, replaced by an unhinged, desperate madman. His tuxedo jacket was ripped. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed entirely on the bright red folder tucked securely under my arm. Sitting alone in that dressing room, facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, Jamal had completely lost his mind. His fractured logic convinced him that if he could just destroy the physical copies of the audit I was holding, he could somehow stop the impending legal slaughter. He did not care about the venue's security. He did not care about the screaming guests. He only cared about saving himself. He charged across the polished marble floor with terrifying speed. He shoved a heavy cocktail table out of his way, sending a large glass floral vase crashing to the ground. Water and shattered crystal exploded across the floor, but Jamal did not even slow down. He screamed my name, a terrifying, violent sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and lunged directly at me, raising his fists to physically attack me and rip the evidence from my hands. Jamal was 3 feet away from me. His hands curled into violent fists, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. He was aiming directly for the heavy red folder tucked under my arm, fully intending to physically assault me in front of 200 people just to destroy a paper copy of his crimes. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even raise my arms to protect myself. I simply planted my feet on the marble floor and watched him make the absolute worst mistake of his entire life. Before his hands could even graze the silk fabric of my dress, a massive wall of solid muscle intercepted him from the blind side. Mr. Sterling had not just called for a standard evacuation. When the screaming started in the ballroom, he had summoned his elite venue security team men who were highly trained to handle unruly, intoxicated country club guests with swift and brutal efficiency. 2 men, both easily over 6 feet tall and built like professional linebackers, hit Jamal simultaneously. The impact was deafening. One guard wrapped his thick arms around Jamal's waist, driving his shoulder directly into Jamal's midsection, while the other guard secured his upper torso. The sheer force of the tackle lifted my husband entirely off his feet. They slammed him down onto the polished marble floor with a bone-crushing thud that echoed into the high vaulted ceilings. They landed right in the center of the spilled water and shattered crystal from the broken floral vase. Jamal let out a breathless, agonizing gasp as the wind was violently knocked out of his lungs. He hit the ground so hard that the expensive fabric of his tailored tuxedo jacket tore sharply at the shoulder seam. But he was operating on pure blind adrenaline. He began thrashing wildly on the floor, kicking his legs and wildly throwing his elbows, trying to break free from the two massive guards pinning him down. He sounded like a cornered rabid animal. He was screaming my name, spitting out vicious curses, entirely abandoning the sophisticated, educated persona he had carefully maintained for the past 5 years. The venue security guards were completely unfazed by his tantrum. One guard drove his knee sharply into the center of Jamal's back, using his full body weight to pin him flat against the wet marble, while the other grabbed both of Jamal's wrists and yanked them aggressively behind his back. The guard shouted in a booming, authoritative voice, ordering Jamal to stop resisting and stay on the ground. The remaining church congregation completely lost whatever fragmented composure they had left. Several of the older women shrieked in absolute terror, scrambling backward and clutching their designer purses as if Jamal was going to break loose and attack them next. Pastor Thomas threw his hands up in the air, loudly calling on the name of the Lord to protect the flock from this violent, demonic presence. The absolute hypocrisy of the moment was almost cinematic. The man they had praised for his corporate success, the man they had believed over me just 30 minutes ago, was now writhing on the floor like a common street thug. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic man who had sworn to love and protect me. His cheek was pressed hard against the cold, wet stone, his face completely distorted by rage and humiliation. He glared up at me, baring his teeth, completely unhinged by the loss of his grand future. Suddenly, the dim, chaotic atmosphere of the country club lobby was pierced by a blinding, rhythmic light. Brilliant flashes of red and blue erupted through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the front of the venue. The strobe lights swept rapidly across the dark mahogany walls, and the crystal chandeliers casting long, frantic shadows across the faces of the horrified guests. A second later, the sharp, deafening wail of multiple police sirens cut through the cool night air, growing rapidly louder until the vehicles came to a screeching halt directly under the grand entrance awning. The church gossips immediately started whispering again, assuming that the venue manager had just dialed 911 to report a physical assault. My mother, Loretta, who was still kneeling on the floor near Jasmine, let out a loud theatrical gasp, clearly terrified that the police were going to arrest her for creating a public disturbance. But I knew exactly why those sirens were blaring, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the broken vase or the tackle on the marble floor. I looked down at Jamal, whose bloodshot eyes were now darting toward the flashing lights outside the glass doors. I leaned slightly forward, keeping my voice cold and precise, ensuring he heard every single word over the wailing sirens. I told him that he actually thought I was going to wait for a delivery truck on Monday morning to secure his destruction. I reminded him that I am a senior forensic accountant, and I do not leave massive corporate fraud cases to the mercy of weekend shipping delays. I explained that 3 hours before I even put on my dress for this ridiculous wedding, I had compiled a fully encrypted digital copy of the entire audit. I had bypassed the standard human resources department and emailed the secure link directly to the private personal email address of the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics. Jamal stopped struggling, the fight completely drained out of his body. He went entirely limp beneath the knees of the security guards. I continued, my tone completely merciless. I told him that I had attached a highly detailed executive summary outlining the exact routing numbers and the forged vendor invoices. I explained that the chief executive officer had immediately contacted his own internal fraud department, verified the missing $150,000 within minutes, and formally pressed corporate theft charges. The police were not here because he tried to hit me. They were here because he was a verified, documented felon. The heavy brass doors of the country club were violently pushed open. 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the lobby, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They were followed immediately by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing dark suits and serious, unamused expressions. The lead detective held up a gold badge, scanning the chaotic room with trained, authoritative eyes. Mr. Sterling quickly stepped forward, pointing directly at the pile of men on the floor. He informed the officers that the venue security had the suspect safely detained. The 2 plainclothes detectives marched straight toward us, completely ignoring the whispering church crowd. The lead detective looked down at Jamal, pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, and asked if he was Jamal Anthony Carter. Jamal did not answer. He just squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The detective did not wait for a verbal confirmation. He signaled to the uniformed officers. They stepped forward, told the security guards to step back, and roughly hauled Jamal up from the floor. They slammed him face first against the polished oak wood of the reception desk. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent lobby. The detective stood directly behind him and began reciting his Miranda rights in a loud, clear, and totally emotionless voice. He stated that Jamal was being placed under arrest for felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny against Vanguard Logistics. The specific mention of the corporate charges sent a fresh shockwave through the congregation. Until that exact moment, some of the church elders might have still believed this was just a bitter marital dispute over money and infidelity. But hearing a federal detective officially name his employer and state the charges completely validated everything I had said. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not a jealous, lying woman. I was the one who had caught a thief. Jamal was yanked forcefully around to face the room. His hands were securely bound behind his back. The torn sleeve of his tuxedo hung loosely from his shoulder, and his expensive white shirt was soaked with water from the broken vase. He looked completely defeated, a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant man who had proudly stood up at the reception table just an hour earlier. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, brimming with tears of absolute terror. He opened his mouth, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whisper, begging me to call my lawyers. He pleaded with me to tell the detectives that I would pay back the stolen money, that I would cover the $150,000, if they would just let him go. He actually thought he could still use me as his personal ATM to buy his way out of a federal crime. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unbreakable ice. I told him that my lawyers only represent innocent clients. I looked at the lead detective and calmly introduced myself, providing my professional credentials. I informed the detective that I possessed the complete physical dossier of the forensic audit, including all bank statements, forged signatures, and traced offshore accounts. I tapped the bright red folder under my arm and promised to hand it over to the precinct first thing Monday morning. The detective nodded at me respectfully, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done, and grabbed Jamal by the bicep. They began to drag him toward the grand exit doors, pulling him directly through the center of the lobby. Jamal was forced to walk the ultimate path of shame. He was paraded right past the church elders who had worshipped his polished exterior. He was dragged past Pastor Thomas, who completely turned his head away, refusing to even look at the fallen man. He was pulled past my mother, who was still kneeling on the floor staring at him, with a mixture of horror and profound realization that her grand master plan had ended in handcuffs. But as the officers dragged him closer to the glass doors, Jamal dug his expensive leather shoes into the marble floor, desperately trying to slow down. He twisted his head around, frantically searching the crowd, until he locked eyes with Jasmine. My sister was standing near the coat check, clutching her ruined designer wedding dress, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. Jamal screamed her name. He begged her to help him. He yelled that they had promised to build a life together. He pleaded with her to call a bail bondsman, to use whatever money she had left to get him out of the holding cell tonight so they could figure out a plan. He was looking at his mistress, the woman he had risked his entire marriage and his freedom for expecting her to stand by his side. Jasmine took a slow, terrified step backward. She looked at the man in handcuffs, looked at the stern faces of the police officers, and completely shut down. The thought of associating herself with a publicly humiliated broke felon terrified her more than anything else in the world. She shook her head rapidly, her face twisting into a mask of pure denial. She raised her voice, ensuring everyone in the lobby heard her, and screamed that she did not know anything about his stolen money. She called him a criminal and a liar, telling the police to take him away before he ruined her life any further. The absolute betrayal hit Jamal harder than the physical tackle. The realization that he had sacrificed his seven-figure marriage, his career, and his freedom for a deeply selfish, opportunistic woman completely broke him. He let out a loud, agonizing sob as the officers finally shoved him through the heavy brass doors and out into the cool night air. He was pushed aggressively into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing his fate. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the country club one last time before the sirens wailed again and the vehicle sped off down the long, winding driveway, taking my treacherous husband out of my life forever. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared down the long, winding driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club, taking the last remnants of my 5-year marriage with them. The wail of the police sirens faded into the cool night air, leaving behind a silence so heavy and absolute, it felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. The grand marble lobby, which had been buzzing with the elite members of our church congregation just an hour ago, now resembled the aftermath of a catastrophic natural disaster. The few remaining venue staff members stood frozen near the coat check, unsure of how to proceed. Pastor Thomas and the last lingering church elders had quietly slipped out the side doors, completely abandoning my mother and sister the moment the handcuffs came out. I stood near the center of the room, the thick red folder still tucked securely under my arm. I watched the heavy brass doors swing shut, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of liberation washing over me. The heavy chain of obligation that had been wrapped around my neck for my entire adult life had finally been severed. But the evening was not quite over. The collateral damage of Jamal and Jasmine's spectacular greed was still standing right in front of me. Connor was staring blankly at the glass doors, his chest heaving as he processed the sheer magnitude of the nightmare he had just narrowly escaped. The realization that he had legally bound himself to a penniless, manipulative woman who was actively sleeping with her sister's husband had completely drained the life from his face. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto Jasmine. My sister was standing completely alone near the reception desk. The golden child, the flawless beauty who was supposed to ascend to the highest ranks of Atlanta society tonight, looked absolutely pathetic. Her $15,000 designer wedding gown, which I had just formally refused to pay for, was wrinkled and dragging heavily on the wet marble floor. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. She saw Connor looking at her, and her toxic survival instincts immediately kicked in. She took a tentative step toward him, raising her hands in a desperate, placating gesture. She tried to summon the sweet, innocent persona that had always worked so perfectly on our mother. She opened her mouth, her voice trembling, and she actually tried to play the victim. She whimpered his name, taking another step forward, begging him to listen to her. She claimed that Jamal had manipulated her, that she was just confused, and that they could still go to the hotel and figure out how to save their marriage. Connor did not step back. He simply looked at her with a level of disgust so profound, it made Jasmine freeze in her tracks. The wealthy tech entrepreneur illusion was gone, but the furious, deeply humiliated man standing in his place was terrifyingly real. Connor let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings. He looked her up and down, taking in the ruined dress and the tear-stained face, and he verbally dismantled her right there in the lobby. He asked her if she thought he was completely stupid. He raised his voice, the anger vibrating through every single word. He demanded to know how she could stand at an altar, look him in the eyes, and vow to be faithful, while she was secretly planning to move into a luxury penthouse with her brother-in-law. He brought up the Cartier watch she was currently wearing on her wrist, screaming that she was flaunting stolen corporate money right in front of his face. He told her that she was the most disgusting, vile human being he had ever met, and that her entire existence was a cheap, transparent lie. Jasmine flinched as if he had struck her. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, theatrical sob, hoping that her tears would somehow soften his rage. But Connor was completely immune to her manipulation. He reached down and grabbed his left hand. With one violent, aggressive motion, he pulled the heavy gold wedding band off his ring finger. He did not hand it back to her. He did not set it down on a table. Connor locked eyes with my sister and forcefully threw the solid gold ring directly at her feet. The metal struck the polished marble floor with a sharp, piercing ping, bouncing twice before rolling to a stop right against the hem of her unpaid designer gown. Jasmine stared down at the ring in absolute horror. Connor pointed a trembling finger at her face and delivered his final verdict. He announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, that he was calling his lawyers the second their office opened on Monday morning. He stated that he was filing for an immediate expedited annulment on the grounds of severe premeditated fraud. He told her that their marriage was completely dead before the ink on the certificate even had a chance to dry. He took a step back, gesturing broadly toward her extravagant bridal attire. He delivered a parting blow that completely shattered whatever fragile ego my sister had left. He reminded her that the lavish reception she had planned was canceled. Her honeymoon tickets were voided, and she was currently standing in a $15,000 dress that she could not even afford to take off her own back. He did not wait for a response. Connor turned on his heel, pushed open the heavy brass doors, and walked out into the night, leaving his bride completely isolated in the ruins of her own making. Jasmine collapsed against the reception desk, sliding slowly down the dark oak wood until she hit the floor. She buried her face in her knees and began to weep uncontrollably. There were no cameras left to capture her performance. There was no wealthy groom to manipulate. There was no secret lover waiting to whisk her away. She was completely and utterly alone. But the true desperation in the room had not yet reached its peak. A few feet away, my mother had watched the entire exchange. Loretta had watched Connor throw the ring. She had watched her golden child lose the wealthy groom. She had watched the grand illusion of her high society family burn to ash. And most importantly, she had remembered the devastating legal document I had revealed just moments ago. The bank was seizing her house in 14 days. The crushing reality of her impending homelessness completely overrode her shock. Her mind frantically searched for a lifeline. Jasmine was officially useless, a broke, abandoned bride with a ruined reputation. The church congregation had fled, and Pastor Thomas had actively turned his back on her. There was only one person left in the entire world who possessed the financial power to stop the county sheriff from throwing her furniture out onto the street. Loretta turned her head and looked at me. I was standing quietly near the exit, my posture perfectly straight, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I was preparing to walk out the door and step into my waiting town car. Panic completely consumed my mother. The arrogant, judgmental matriarch who had spent the last 35 years making me feel completely worthless suddenly realized that her actual physical survival depended entirely on my mercy. She completely abandoned whatever shredded remnants of pride she still possessed. Loretta pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. The fabric of her expensive evening gown snagged on the marble floor, but she did not care. She began to crawl. She literally dragged herself across the cold stone floor of the country club lobby, crawling frantically toward where I was standing. She reached me before I could even take a step toward the door. Her hands shot out trembling violently, and her fingers clamped down hard around my ankles. I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Her fake eyelashes were peeling off, and her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She gripped my legs tightly, burying her face against my designer shoes, and she began to beg. It was not a proud request. It was the desperate, breathless pleading of a woman who was staring directly into the abyss. She sobbed my name, her voice cracking and raw. She pleaded with me to forget everything that had happened tonight. She begged me to ignore the video, to ignore Jamal, to ignore the fact that she had actively tried to force me out of the building just an hour ago to protect Jasmine. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and wild. She screamed that she was going to be homeless. She cried that she was 60 years old and had absolutely nowhere to go. She told me that I was a millionaire, that my forensic accounting firm generated more money in a month than she owed the bank. She pleaded that writing a check to pay off the reverse mortgage foreclosure would be nothing to me. It would just be a drop in the bucket of my wealth. She tightened her grip on my ankles, resorting to the ultimate emotional weapon of a toxic parent. She invoked the sacred bond of motherhood. She wept loudly, reminding me that she carried me in her womb. She cried that she had put a roof over my head when I was a child, and that it was my absolute duty before God to make sure my mother did not die on the streets. She begged me to find it in my heart to show her the grace that she had so violently denied me my entire life. I stood perfectly still, letting her tears soak into the leather of my shoes. I looked down at her, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the heavy, crushing burden of the strong black woman trope that demands we set ourselves on fire to keep our abusive families warm. Our culture constantly preaches that we must forgive our toxic elders, that we must carry the dead weight of our relatives, and that establishing boundaries is a sign of disrespect. I had played that role perfectly for a decade. I had paid the tuitions, covered the mortgages, and funded the lavish lifestyles, hoping that one day my generosity would finally earn me my mother's genuine love. But looking at Loretta groveling on the floor, I finally understood the truth. She did not love me. She loved my bank account. She loved the shelter my money provided. If Jasmine had successfully pulled off her plot with Jamal to steal my business, my mother would have gladly stepped over my ruined, bankrupt body to attend Jasmine's housewarming party at that secret penthouse. I felt a profound, absolute peace settle over my entire spirit. The emotional audit was complete, and the account was permanently closed. I slowly bent down at the waist. I did not jerk my legs away from her. I did not yell or raise my voice. I reached down with calm, steady hands. I placed my fingers over her wrists, and gently, but with absolute unbreakable firmness, I pried my mother's frantic hands off my ankles. Loretta gasped, looking up at me with sheer terror as I stepped back, severing the physical contact. I stood up straight and opened the gold clasp of my designer clutch. I bypassed my platinum credit cards and my car keys. I reached into a small side pocket and pulled out a simple matte white business card. I looked down at the woman still kneeling on the marble floor. I extended my arm and handed the card down to her. Loretta took it with a shaking hand. She stared at the small piece of cardboard, her tear-filled eyes struggling to read the bold black print under the bright lobby lights. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of profound confusion and rising panic. She stammered, asking me what this was, desperately hoping it was the contact information for my private wealth manager or my real estate attorney. I kept my voice incredibly soft, perfectly even and colder than ice. I told her it was the direct hotline number and address for the Grace House Women's Shelter in downtown Atlanta. I explained that I sit on their board of directors and personally fund a significant portion of their annual operating budget. I told her that they have clean beds, hot meals, and excellent financial literacy counselors who specialize in helping elderly women transition through bankruptcy and eviction. My mother stared at the business card as if it were a venomous snake. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute reality that I was not going to write a check, that I was actually going to let the bank take her house, finally broke through her delusion. She looked up at me, a silent, desperate plea hanging in the air between us. I looked directly into her eyes, ensuring that my final words to her would be etched into her memory forever. I told her I was done funding my own abuse. I did not wait to watch her react. I did not wait for Jasmine to start screaming again. I simply turned my back on them, pushed open the heavy brass doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club, and walked out into the cool, quiet night. My black town car was idling by the curb, the driver holding the rear door open for me. I stepped inside, settled into the plush leather seat, and instructed him to take me home. The heavy door of this black town car closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly sealing out the frantic, desperate energy of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The thick, tinted glass acted as an absolute barrier between my new reality and the toxic wasteland I had just left behind. I leaned back against the plush leather seating, letting my head rest against the headrest as my driver smoothly shifted the vehicle into gear. The powerful engine purred quietly, and the car glided away from the curb, moving effortlessly down the long, winding driveway, lined with manicured oak trees. I turned my head slightly, looking out the back window. The grand illuminated columns of the country club were already shrinking in the distance. I could see the faint silhouettes of people still lingering near the valet stand, likely whispering about the spectacular collapse of Loretta and Jasmine. I watched the building grow smaller and smaller until the car turned onto the main road and the venue completely vanished from my sight. I did not shed a single tear. I did not experience the sudden, overwhelming wave of guilt that toxic parents constantly condition their children to expect when setting boundaries. There was no tightness in my chest, no lingering doubt about whether I had gone too far. For my entire adult life, I had been force-fed the narrative that family was an unbreakable bond, a sacred obligation that required infinite forgiveness and endless financial sacrifice. I had been taught that as a successful Black woman, it was my absolute duty to carry the dead weight of my relatives, to endure their disrespect in silence, and to use my hard-earned resources to elevate people who fundamentally despised my independence. But as I watched the dark, quiet streets of Atlanta roll by outside my window, that heavy, suffocating chain simply evaporated. The narrative was dead. I had audited my own family, and I had permanently closed their accounts. The privacy partition behind the driver's seat was raised, wrapping the back of the spacious town car in a quiet, intimate seclusion. Soft, ambient blue lighting illuminated the luxurious interior. I reached forward and opened the sleek wooden panel that concealed the vehicle's built-in mini fridge. The cool air wafted over my hands as I reached inside and pulled out a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. This was not the cheap, watered-down sparkling wine that Jasmine had aggressively demanded I purchase for her 200 wedding guests. This was authentic, incredibly expensive champagne that I kept reserved specifically for celebrating major corporate victories. Tonight was undoubtedly the greatest victory of my entire career. I carefully peeled back the gold foil and untwisted the wire cage. With a firm, controlled grip, I popped the cork. It released with a crisp, muted sigh rather than a loud explosion, a perfect reflection of my own quiet, calculated triumph. I poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute, watching the delicate bubbles rise rapidly to the surface. I raised the glass, holding it up to the dim ambient light, and offered a silent toast to the empty car. I toasted to my freedom. I toasted to the end of the manipulation. I toasted to the beautiful, undeniable power of cold, hard evidence. I brought the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne was perfectly crisp, carrying the subtle, complex notes of toasted brioche and green apple. As the cool liquid hit the back of my throat, a profound physical reaction cascaded through my entire body. The rigid tension that I had been carrying in my shoulders for the past 10 years completely dissolved. The constant low-grade anxiety of waiting for my mother's next financial emergency or anticipating Jasmine's next manufactured crisis completely vanished from my nervous system. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air of the car, and for the first time in a decade, the air tasted completely clean. I kicked off my expensive designer heels, letting my bare feet rest on the soft, thick carpeting of the floorboards. I closed my eyes, allowing the gentle, rhythmic motion of the car to lull me into a state of absolute tranquility. I thought about Jamal sitting in the back of a rigid, uncomfortable police cruiser, his wrists bound by cold steel, rapidly approaching the stark reality of a federal holding cell. I thought about Connor, pacing furiously in the dark, drafting an annulment that would completely strip Jasmine of her coveted married status. I thought about my mother, desperately clutching the business card for a women's shelter, finally forced to face the catastrophic consequences of her own financial vanity. They had all played a dangerous game of extortion, relying on my predicted silence and my conditioned obedience to pull off the ultimate heist. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the woman they were trying to rob. They mistook my patience for weakness. They mistook my financial generosity for emotional desperation. They never stopped to consider that a woman who builds a multi-million-dollar forensic accounting firm from scratch does not survive in the ruthless corporate world by letting people steal from her. I had simply applied my professional expertise to my personal life, and the results were flawlessly devastating. The ride back to my private estate felt incredibly short, a fleeting journey bridging the gap between my abusive past and my completely liberated future. When the town car finally pulled through the heavy wrought iron security gates of my property and came to a stop in front of my beautifully illuminated home, I felt entirely reborn. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cool night breeze rustling the silk of my gown, and walked through my front door into a house that was finally truly mine. There were no hidden cameras waiting to catch a cheating husband. There were no frantic voicemails from my mother demanding money. There was only silence, luxury, and absolute peace. But the emotional victory of Saturday night was only the beginning. The spectacular explosion at the Oak Ridge Country Club was the social execution, but the legal slaughter was scheduled to begin the moment the sun rose on Monday morning. I am a forensic accountant, and I know that revenge is never truly complete until it is legally codified, filed with the courts, and permanently bound by the aggressive parameters of the law. When my alarm went off at exactly 5 in the morning on Monday, I did not wake up feeling tired. I woke up with the sharp, laser-focused energy of an apex predator stepping into the boardroom. I traded my silk evening gown for a perfectly tailored dark navy power suit. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, booted up my secure dual-monitor workstation in my home office, and initiated the final phase of my master plan. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my lead divorce attorney, a terrifyingly brilliant woman named Evelyn Thorne, filed an emergency ex parte motion with the Fulton County Superior Court. Armed with the irrefutable evidence from my red folder, including the high-definition video confession and the documented proof of Jamal's federal wire fraud, Evelyn did not just ask for a standard separation. She completely bypassed the typical drawn-out divorce proceedings and moved directly for a catastrophic asset freeze. Because Jamal had explicitly stated on camera that his entire intention was to frame me for infidelity to trigger a fraudulent payout from our prenuptial agreement, and because he had used our shared marital address to conduct his illegal activities, Evelyn successfully argued that he posed an immediate severe threat to my personal safety and my corporate holdings. By 9:30 in the morning, a sympathetic and highly alarmed judge signed the emergency orders. The swiftness of the legal strike was absolutely breathtaking. Within minutes of the judge's signature, electronic notices were dispatched to every major financial institution in the state. Every single joint checking and savings account Jamal and I had ever opened was instantly frozen and locked down, completely cutting off his access to my money. His personal credit cards, which were strictly backed by my corporate guarantor status, were unilaterally canceled. The luxury sports car he loved to show off to his friends was formally reported as a contested marital asset, meaning he could not sell it, hide it, or even legally drive it out of the state without risking grand theft auto charges. While Evelyn was securing my financial fortress in family court, the federal authorities were actively dismantling Jamal's life in the criminal sector. The 3 identical FedEx packages containing my comprehensive audit had arrived exactly on schedule. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics received his package at 8:45. By 10 o'clock, Jamal's employment was officially terminated with extreme prejudice. His corporate stock options were completely revoked, and a massive civil lawsuit for restitution was filed against him by the company's aggressive legal department. The Internal Revenue Service received their package just before noon. The detailed tracing of Jamal's undeclared offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands immediately triggered a massive multi-agency tax evasion investigation. The government does not take kindly to citizens hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in shadow accounts, and the swiftness with which they moved to place a federal lien on his remaining personal assets was a beautiful testament to the power of a perfectly organized audit. I sat at my desk watching the confirmation emails roll into my encrypted inbox one by one. I monitored the financial dashboards, verifying that the asset freezes were holding secure. I was systematically cutting off every single avenue of escape, ensuring that when Jamal finally posted bail for his initial arrest, he would walk out of the county jail with absolutely nothing. No job, no money, no car, and no high-powered legal defense team to save him from the federal prosecutors who were already lining up to offer him a plea deal that involved significant prison time. The legal machinery was operating flawlessly, completely isolating the parasites and leaving them to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of their own actions. 6 months have passed since that catastrophic Monday morning, and the seasons have changed along with the entire trajectory of my existence. The chaotic noise of my past has been completely replaced by the beautiful, uninterrupted silence of a life fully within my control. When I look out through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office today, I do not see the heavy, suffocating expectations of my toxic family. I only see the horizon I built for myself. The legal machinery I set into motion operated with absolute ruthless efficiency. Right now, Jamal is sitting in a federal penitentiary holding facility just outside the city limits. He is no longer wearing the custom-tailored Italian suits I bought for him, and he is certainly not driving the luxury sports car he used to proudly park in front of his friends. He is wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit awaiting his official criminal trial for felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. When Vanguard Logistics filed their massive civil lawsuit against him, it completely drained whatever meager personal funds he had managed to hide outside of my audit. Without my corporate accounts to fund a high-powered million-dollar defense team, he was assigned a severely overworked public defender. He tried to negotiate a plea deal. He desperately offered to surrender his offshore Cayman Island accounts in exchange for leniency, completely forgetting that the federal prosecutors already had the entire financial map I provided. They laughed at his offer. His trial begins next month, and given the sheer volume of the evidence and the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for federal financial crimes, Jamal will not be attending any country club events for a very long time. His arrogance convinced him he could outsmart a forensic accountant, and that fatal miscalculation cost him his freedom. The downfall of my mother and sister was equally severe, though their punishment is playing out in the harsh light of civil reality rather than a criminal courtroom. Connor kept his furious promise. He filed for an expedited annulment the very next morning, legally erasing his brief, disastrous marriage to Jasmine before it even had a chance to register in the state database. Stripped of her wealthy white knight and completely cut off from my bank accounts, Jasmine had to face the brutal reality of the real world for the very first time in her 32 years of life. 2 weeks after the wedding catastrophe, the county sheriff arrived at my mother's beautiful brick colonial house. The bank formally foreclosed on the property, changing the locks and forcing Loretta to pack 30 years of memories and a lifetime of manufactured high society illusions into a few cheap cardboard boxes. They had absolutely nowhere to go. Jasmine's secret luxury penthouse, the love nest she had planned to share with my husband, was immediately seized as part of Jamal's federal asset forfeiture. Today, my mother and my sister share a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space is so small they can barely walk past each other without brushing shoulders. Jasmine, the precious golden child who believed she was too beautiful and too important to finish her college degree, is currently working a minimum-wage retail job. She spends her days folding clothes and dealing with angry customers at a discount department store just to keep their electricity turned on. I heard through the church grapevine that a few of the older congregation members actually ran into her at the mall, and Jasmine was so humiliated she hid in the stockroom until they left. My mother is living her absolute worst nightmare. The church community she sacrificed my sanity to impress completely turned their backs on her. In our community, financial struggles can be forgiven, but public fraud and the exposure of a scandalous affair between a golden child and a son-in-law is a stain that never washes out. Pastor Thomas stopped returning her calls, and the women who used to praise her boundless faith now cross the street when they see her waiting at the bus stop. My mother and sister are trapped in that tiny apartment together, isolated from the world with nothing but their own bitter resentment to keep them warm. They finally have the exclusive, undivided relationship they always wanted. They just have to enjoy it in poverty. As for me, The legal slaughter I initiated was flawlessly executed. Evelyn, my brilliant divorce attorney, absolutely decimated Jamal's ridiculous claims to my business. Because of his documented criminal activity, his blatant attempt to defraud our marital estate, and the undeniable breach of our prenuptial agreement, the judge threw out every single one of his requests for alimony and asset division. My divorce was officially finalized last week. I walked away with 100% of my forensic accounting firm, my real estate portfolio, my investment accounts, and every single dollar I had earned with my own two hands. I am currently sitting behind a massive glass desk in my new penthouse corner office. My firm has expanded significantly over the last 6 months. The high-profile exposure of the Vanguard Logistics embezzlement case ironically brought me a massive wave of new corporate clients who wanted my firm to audit their own executives. I have hired 5 new junior accountants, all brilliant young Black women who remind me of myself, and I am mentoring them to ensure they understand their worth both in the boardroom and in their personal lives. The air up here is incredibly clear, and the peace I feel when I lock my front door at night is absolutely golden. Getting to this place required making the hardest decision of my entire life. In our culture, Black women are constantly handed the heaviest burdens and told to carry them with a smile. We are conditioned from birth to believe that our success is not truly ours, that it is a communal resource meant to patch up the financial holes created by the irresponsible people sharing our bloodline. We are called the backbone of the family. We are praised for our resilience, our strength, and our endless capacity to endure pain. But nobody ever stops to ask how much damage that resilience is doing to our own spirits. We are told to pray away the abuse. We are instructed to forgive the people who continuously use us and to prioritize family loyalty over our own mental, emotional, and financial survival. We are taught that setting boundaries is a form of disrespect and that walking away makes us bitter and cold. But loyalty without respect is just manipulation. I had to learn the hard way that you cannot heal a generational curse by continuing to fund it. You cannot save people who are perfectly willing to hold your head underwater just so they can use your shoulders as a stepping stone. Setting ironclad boundaries does not make you a bitter woman. It makes you a protected woman. It makes you a woman who finally understands the true value of her own peace. I had to completely sever the ties with the woman who gave me life and the sister I grew up with because they looked at my success and saw nothing but an endless buffet for their own greed. They demanded my resources but despised my independence. Walking away from them saved my empire, but more importantly, it saved my soul. I no longer flinch when my phone rings. I no longer shrink my accomplishments to make other people comfortable. I no longer fund my own abuse. I am whole, I am protected, and for the first time in my 35 years on this earth, I am completely and undeniably free. The greatest lesson from my journey is that your hard-earned success should never be held hostage by your family's toxic expectations. Too often, we are conditioned to be the unbreakable backbone, sacrificing our peace and financial security to carry the dead weight of those who share our bloodline. But let me be clear. Loyalty without mutual respect is simply exploitation. True strength isn't enduring abuse in silence just to keep up appearances. It is having the courage to audit your inner circle, sever ties with the parasites, and fiercely protect the empire you built. You cannot heal a generational curse by continuing to fund it. If you are ready to stop funding your own abuse and start claiming your peace, hit subscribe and share this video with a woman who needs to hear this today.